I'm Rain. I'm just an organizer at Defund, but specifically I work with Defund the Police to run the anti-racist youth consultation sessions.
Would you mind explaining to me a little bit about what this involves?
Sure. The project that we run at Defund the Police basically entails us, me and a colleague, going into youth centers. So far two, but hopefully expanding in the coming months, in Cotonou and NDG, to talk to Black and racialized youth about their experiences of discrimination, so racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, Islamophobia, you name it, in schools, as well as their experiences of policing. But then we also get into other topics depending on how the sessions are going. And then we take notes and kind of record data from those sessions in order to kind of establish a foundation as to why it's necessary to get police out of schools.
And were you a part of establishing this?
So I wasn't a part of establishing Defund the Police as a subcommittee, but I've been involved in the youth project from the beginning. But I would say it's more a collective effort than anything.
Okay, and do you mind if I ask how long this has been going on for?
So Defund the Police started in the summer, or just shortly after the summer of 2020. And then the youth project started in October of 2021.
Okay, cool. That's really cool. Good to know. Thanks for sharing. I guess I'll get into it. Just kind of broadly speaking, what are your thoughts on the city of Montreal approving the second highest budget towards the SPVM, I guess, in history?
So I'll just say right now, Montreal has the largest police force per capita, while also having right now the largest police budget increase in 2022, and at the same time has the lowest public support for policing and the highest support for the defund movement in the city. What are my thoughts on the police increasing the budget and having it be the biggest budget increase in the entire country? It's disappointing, and certainly speaks to the fact that elected officials are beyond not prioritizing, actively targeting marginalized communities in Montreal, in voting to increase the budget by $45 million. Elected officials in Montreal are proving to every Black, Indigenous, and racialized person in the city that our safety is not a priority. Is proving to youth who are accessing youth programming and to the people who are offering frontline services to youth and to people who experience homelessness, to people who access any kind of social programming, that they are not a priority. And honestly, it's just indicative of the ways that the SPVM manages to intimidate and manipulate elected officials in power right now.
Would you mind expanding on that a little bit more, the intimidation?
Yeah, sure. So I think last year, the SPVM overspent $51 million. So they spent $51 million more than what was in their budget. And no other, municipal department can get away with spending that much money, overspending that much money, going that far out of the limits of their budget without some kind of consequence. But the city of Montreal is now rewarding the SPVM with a $45 million budget increase. That not being enough, the chief of police, Caron, has claimed that the budget's restrictive and is saying that they won't be able to operate their PDQs or the neighborhood police stations if they don't receive any additional funding. But that's a very clear kind of tactic of manipulation, in that they're kind of using this public anxiety around, public safety, to manipulate elected officials into, playing their games. So like PDQs are kind of posited as these bastions of bastions of community safety and being essential to community policing, even though they're not. And so there's this kind of question of like, why does the SPVM have this power where they can overspend, lie about their budget needs, and then use kind of these fears around public safety to manipulate the administration without ever being held to account. The worst part about all of that, so, the $45 million increase not being enough for Quran, is that Plante and the official opposition have now pledged to do everything possible to maintain the PDQs, which means that there's a chance that the budget will be increased even more, which is ridiculous and really speaks to the power that the SPVM holds over the political landscape in Montreal.
Do you think with, circumstances like this, our elected officials and overall just kind of like the liberal conservative mindset is focused around, we can only have public safety through police, through law enforcement, these types of things?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of there's a lot of propaganda that police services across the country put out in order to put forward this image of being, people who bring safety to communities, as opposed to being people who regularly intimidate, brutalize, and kill people in Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities everywhere. I think there's definitely an idea that exists that community safety can only exist if there's policing, but I would say that that's in large part the result of very concentrated campaigns, media campaigns, and that start from when people are very young. I'm thinking of the show Paw Patrol right now, which is a strange example, but all children's television being very pro-policing and not offering any alternatives to community safety, when community alternatives exist, when there are organizations that do work to talk to youth about violence and the things that happen in their communities that are localized. There are alternatives to policing. It's just that people are not taught about them.
Yep. Paw Patrol is a great example. I didn't even think of that right away. Yeah. Okay, maybe this is a little bit cheesy, but when I was kind of thinking about this story, I was thinking about this line in that Tupac song "Changes," where he mentions, people don't commit crimes unless they have to, and I don't know. I think that's very telling. But do you think, specifically in Montreal? I mean, I know there's kind of an argument whether the amount of I guess how do I say this? The fact that the SPVM is saying criminal activity is increasing, gun violence is such a thing, and this ideology is really furthered by the Plante administration. But I guess in Montreal, do you think that a lot of the crime that is actually happening really stems from social inequality and lack of kind of support services to deal with this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that if there was funding available for a myriad of other things, and youth centers and programming, any kind of adequate healthcare, housing, social housing, food security programs, education, assault crisis centers, mental health care, like any of these things that are like chronically underfunded by every municipality across the country, but especially in the context of Montreal. I think it's hard to speak to like all of crime as a concept, but like, yeah, I think that a lot of harm and violence that happens can be prevented by funding things such as community housing, any kind of social programming, youth programming. Yeah, and you know what? In the Montreal context, there's not, even though there are community organizations. I'm thinking of the Posé Coalition. There are community organizations who are doing work to prevent violence amongst youth, who aren't getting the funding they deserve, who are not getting anything compared to the enormous budget that the police have. Yeah, when youth do on the ground work in response to violence in their communities, like the Posé Coalition, they don't get support from the municipality. There are things that people in communities here, for example, in Montreal Nord, organizers have been calling for the council to address issues of infrastructure in the community. You know, they've been asking for a sports center in the community. And despite promising, a sports center during her campaign, Valerie Plante is now kind of going back on that promise. And this has been now three previous administrations have also went back on that promise. So if a community is repeatedly asking for something, a highly Black and racialized community like Montreal Nord is asking for something over and over and over again, and the city of Montreal is repeatedly denying this request and instead funding policing in response to violence in communities that are chronically underserved, you have to at some point understand that that is a targeted decision. I don't know if I really answered your question about people committing crime in terms of social inequality. I think it's hard to say what leads people to violence, and I think that's one of the key questions guiding like discussions and amongst abolitionists. Like,
No, 100%. It's I think it's difficult to, as you said earlier, speak for kind of like all crime in all of these situations. But I think, yeah, I heard, I think last week about that, the sports center in Montreal Nord. And I think that's like a really interesting and really great example. And I didn't actually know that previous administrations had been dismissing this. Is it kind of like, I guess to get more into detail to that, if we're not providing, opportunities like someone who would like to see themselves in a career in sports or just kind of like, different creative opportunities or scholarly opportunities to racialized communities, to low income communities, is this kind of obviously not in all cases, but sometimes like can crime like stem from this, like due to specifically lack of opportunities?
um, I don't know. I don't know if I'm qualified to speak to that, but I would imagine like I think that sometimes like people will do things out of necessity when they're not provided any kind of social support. And when if you're experiencing like homelessness and food insecurity and you are having to do anything to get by, knowing full well that the social security net that's meant to protect you from falling through the cracks is not going to do that, then yeah, it makes sense that people would turn to crime. And it's also, I think, important to kind of consider like what is understood as crime. Like, you know, this like there are people who define what criminality is, and those definitions are not without political motivation. Um,
I don't want you to repeat yourself too much. I know you already started to answer this, but is there anything maybe you want to add to why is increased policing detrimental to our society?
yeah, sure. could talk about this for a while, but I think in kind of a tangible, immediate sense, like an increase in policing means that there's, more money going towards a group of people who are taught to see Black and Native and racialized people as violent. Montreal has seen a lot of police violence against Black folks and Indigenous folks here recently and just historically. I think it's detrimental because you're taking money away from social services that can do the work of community safety much better in a more localized way, in a way that truly addresses needs in ways that are preventative, that stop violence from happening before it happens. Something that's come up a lot, in the wake of the tragedy that occurred at Malland High School in October, is that parents at that school have been calling for increased, social supports, after school spaces, just so that students have a place to be and people, adults around who can offer supports and guidance and mentorship. I think spaces like that are crucial to ensuring that youth don't fall through the cracks of the system. And I think when the police budget is just getting enormous increases every year upon year, it just speaks to the absolute, the grip that the SPVM has on the political landscape here. And it speaks to a lack of care and attention paid to our communities. More policing is not the answer to it won't solve violence. More policing will not address violence. More prisons will not address violence. It doesn't reduce crime. The things that policing claims it doesn't even do those things. It doesn't do those things. It doesn't reduce crime. It doesn't reduce violence. It simply marginalizes people to a greater extent than they already are.
And why do you think that anti-racism trainings, like multicultural trainings, things like this, why is this not enough for police to do better?
Yeah. I think embedded in the foundations and structures of policing is anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity. I think fundamentally the history of policing in Canada and the United States and arguably across the world, but specifically in these contexts, the histories of these things were specifically to steal this land and also to ensure the subjugation of Black people who were brought here. And so no matter how many diversity trainings or multiculturalism trainings or how many token QT BIPOC police officers are hired, it doesn't matter. It won't. Having, these very small token gestures do nothing to address the systemic issues that policing presents and, does nothing to mitigate the violence that police cause in these communities.
I spoke with Ted Rutland today, and he was telling me in the late 80s they had a very I don't know his exact wording, but kind of well put together anti-racism training. And he said, following this, they had some of the highest rates of police like targeting and like harming racialized communities. So yeah, that's like, I think that's important to think of within the context of these trainings. So thank you for elaborating on this. Going into the French police, if you're okay talking about this, you know, do you think like in terms of the movement to defund the police, and I guess, you know, specifically this is a thing in Quebec, do you think that these French police, you know, they count as a form of policing that, you know, di is like a disadvantage to non-French speaking communities and possibly harmful for these communities?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think so. And you know, it's quite possible that I'm biased since I'm Anglo, but I don't know. I've spoken to some youth who are in high schools here, and in particular have talked about the difficulties that having to do education entirely in French without adequate supports has posed. And that's deeply concerning to me because, like I said before, the kids that I talk to are mainly Black and racialized kids. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's right for a student to have to feel like they're stumbling through school without adequate supports. I don't know why the government or Ministry of Education expects students to be able to just pick up French quickly and easily without you know, adequate supports in place to ensure that happening. And I think it has hugely detrimental impacts on who is able to access or who is able to be politically engaged here, which I think is, you know, in itself kind of a form of policing. If certain communities are not, you know, privy to political processes that are happening because there's a language barrier, and that language barrier is not being adequately addressed by anyone. So I'm thinking of like, that's a small example, but like when the budget for 2022 was released, it was on the city website, but it was only in French for a few days. But that you know, few days can mean a lot to someone who is trying to maybe submit questions to council, or who's trying to, you know, create some kind of mobilization around what the city is spending its money on. And I think it's things like that that are subtle, but that add up across every institution in the city of Montreal and across Quebec, that serve to marginalize immigrants, mainly, and yeah, people who obviously don't speak French in the province.
Is there anything like you'd like to say towards kind of like positive reinforcement and like actual support, you know, in terms of French and in terms of, you know, living in like a crime-free society, and just even as well, kind of like following COVID measures instead of relying on like this heavily policing? Like, how can we encourage people to do it without policing that is maybe more successful than policing?
Are you talking about like how to kind of better convey like that people should follow COVID regulations without the things like the fine and stuff like that?
Yeah, like COVID regulations, even things like, you know, learning French, even just like having a more, I guess, just like, I don't know, crime-free society, these type of things.
Right. Well, I think in terms of support, like I think with COVID stuff in particular, I think the fine was obviously very, you know, classist and like very violent to anyone who has experiences barriers to being vaccinated or having a vaccine passport. And I think that information around COVID has not been communicated very clearly to people. And I think in part there's that's something to do with the language divide. But I also think it like, you know, the language divide contributes, I think, hugely to like a great amount of disorganization within the bureaucracy of the city of Montreal. and that causes its communication efforts to be delayed and complicated in ways that other municipalities don't experience. And in terms of supports with learning French, I think that there are ways. So earlier, what I was saying about funding youth programming, I think like it's not that difficult to understand that certain youth are going to experience more barriers in regards to learning French than others, and that funding should be put towards places such as youth centers and youth initiatives and community initiatives that aim to support immigrant youth, Black youth, racialized youth, Indigenous youth, youth who, are, who are marginalized, in order to, learn French, whether that's like, I think there's a lot of kind of programming around learning French if you're a newcomer to Quebec. But it's also, for many people, like I know that there's there's a course where you can go 4 nights a week and then learn French within, over the course of a few months and then take an exam. But if you're someone who needs to work, or who has a very, for whatever reason can't attend a class 4 nights a week to learn French, that's not exactly a solution to the problem. It's just frustrating that, there's not adequate supports provided to people to learn French, but then they are also penalized and punished for not knowing French. So I think, in terms of creating societies that are crime-free, which I don't think is possible. Also, I will say that I think that crime will always happen and that people will always harm each other, and that's kind of one of the conditions of being alive. But I think that the ways that it's dealt with can be very radically different. And in part, I think the context of French in Montreal is a complicated issue because I think it's used, French is someone not knowing French is kind of used as punishment until they learn it. You can't really access certain spaces, you can't really access government, or political spaces, or education in certain places. And while there are Anglo spaces, they're, one, becoming less and less with time, and two, are experiencing stricter and stricter regulations. Yeah, that was a very roundabout way of answering your question, but I hope I covered it.
No, that's good. Thank you. Do you think we can defund and abolish the police within our lifetime?
Defund and abolish in our lifetimes. That's the dream. Whether or not that will happen remains to be seen. But I believe that it will happen. Because I think eventually the truth will win out, and the truth of the matter is that policing doesn't serve the majority of people. It only serves to protect, the richest of the rich and people who own land that they should not own, and the state. And so I think the movement to defund the police across the country is strong, and people are becoming more and more aware of what defunding means and what it means to strive towards abolition. And even in Montreal, Montreal has the highest support for the defund movement here than any other defund stronghold in the country. I think people are, becoming wise to the fact that policing, it is not meant to create community safety. It's not meant to protect us. It's not meant to strengthen our communities. What will strengthen our communities is an understanding of interdependence, an understanding that we can strive to meet one another's needs and meet each other where we're at, that we can try to create things like that we saw right at the beginning of the pandemic, for example, the huge surge of mutual aid groups that sprung up around the country and across the world, where people were delivering groceries to each other and bringing each other food and necessities because in order to, help people who couldn't leave their houses. Things like that are a testament to, the strength of the human spirit. And I think, hopefully, we'll see defunding in our lifetime. But I don't know. I think a common, if I'm, answering your question honestly, and you can cut this out to be honest, but I think a common thing amongst a lot of organizers is that we're organizing for the next generation of people. There's an understanding, I think, that, we'll have to pass the baton at some point. And that's one of the bittersweet things about it. But it's also like you strengthen the foundation for the next generation of organizers to stand upon. And that's important work.
I just have one last question. Unfortunately, after the, I guess during the protests here in Montreal in 2020, when Valerie Plante said that she was open to looking into defunding, and then she went ahead and increased the budget, and it's been the same thing year after year. While I support and appreciate protesting, I guess I'm curious, is there something more radical that we need to do? And what does this look like?
That's a good question. I think there are a lot of really incredible and activated organizers and activists in Montreal, doing work in all kinds of different, movements. And I think I think abolition is one of those things that is common to all of our movements, whether you're fighting for racial justice, for gender justice, for, for climate justice. Abolition is one of those things that speaks to the values we have across movements. And I think that there are a lot of ways for people to contribute to the defund movement that are, because protesting and going to direct actions and demos is really important and can be a really fantastic strategy. But I think too, there are kind of the day-to-day things that you can do, such as asking your counselor questions and pestering the hell out of your administration. And then there are things that you can do, such as, there's popular education workshops that I know Defund is developing right now, in order to, that will be available for use soon for people to use to teach people about community alternatives to policing. I think, addressing issues of how homelessness in Montreal is directly tied to over-policing of Indigenous peoples in Montreal. There's a lot of, that's a really big question. It's big in a good way, in that there's a lot that people can do. And I think Montreal's interesting. I'm kind of new to the scene here. I've been here about 7 months now, I think. And the number of ways that I've seen people mobilize politically, whether that's through, arts and installations, or demos, or arts demos, or, calling their counselors, through, holding town halls and talking to people about what safety alternatives are. If there are a group of people in your community who, feel a certain way about defunding, who are pro-defunding, or who want to learn more or figure out what they can do, I think the biggest thing for young I'm saying this like I'm not 20. The biggest thing for organizers, or for people who are, looking to organize it, for defunding, to do is to talk to each other. And I think, like, figuring out what can be done, talking to people in your schools about defunding, having really candid conversations about policing. I think all of these things, have their role to play in the broader goal of defunding. Yeah. If you're into research, you can definitely, there's like a lot of research to be done about policing, the people's budget in Montreal, like alternatives to policing, the history of policing, and what alternatives exist elsewhere. Yeah, I think too a big part of abolitionist work is harm reduction work. I think harm reduction work is really like a facet of it, where you're looking, and also like oh my gosh, yeah, like striving towards the decriminalization of drug usage and sex work. Also a huge part of abolition. Like, all of these things are really tied into the movement. That's why I'm saying that abolition is kind of this conversation to be had across movements, no matter what movement you work, that you're in struggle for.
If you don't mind me asking you one follow-up from that, I know I've kept you for so long. Um, but I guess just specifically in terms of such a high increase in Montreal, like what what is the priority for people to do right now to make sure, the government doesn't keep letting the police go over budget, funding this budget. We don't see a big increase next year. Like if there's maybe like 2 points where you're like, I mean, I do understand with your answer, it's very, all inclusive. All of these things are to reach the goal. But if it's like, okay,
Specifically in the context of
these are the priority. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
yeah, I mean, I think for me, what I'm thinking about is like, it's important for people to understand, like, that holding your counselors accountable publicly en masse. So I'm thinking things like phones apps, emails apps, letter writing campaigns, all of that stuff. While it seems, small, in tandem with, things like, if you, let's say, write a counselor, you for 3 or 4 hours, you organize a phones app, and you are, repeatedly calling counselors with you and some volunteers and friends, to say, hey, this happened in the budget this year. I'm asking you why. I'm demanding, that the budget not be increased next year and instead be defunded, in order to allocate that money to housing, social programming, youth programming, schools, healthcare, social housing, whatever it may be. I think that's a big thing, and also ensuring that there's, a kind of public follow-up with an initiative like that, because you can't just call your counselors and then kind of leave it at that. There has to be some kind of follow-up with like, okay, we've called our counselors, now we're going to have a protest, or we're going to have an event, and we're going to, hold them to account publicly in this way, and demand that they show up, demand that they talk to us and explain and give us answers. And I think those like initiatives like that are like really helpful. In my experience, like working with the movement in Hamilton, where I'm from, stuff like that proved to be very effective in terms of catalyzing the conversation around defunding the police. I think too, like, yeah, if people are looking to organize around defunding the police, I'd say get in contact with Defund, the SPVM coalition in Montreal. And there are a number of committees to join that are, doing fantastic work and that could use help.